Okay. Hello. Finally everything settled and we can continue. So welcome to the course, and today we have the following plan. First I start with requirement elicitation. We finish, it will not take a long time to finish the topic that we started last lecture, and then we start to consider requirement analysis, another activity in software life cycle. So just to remind you that we consider first what are requirements, what are general characteristics of requirement, what are methods for requirement elicitation, general method, risk, prioritization, and so on. And finally we decided to consider one particular case when we develop requirements using particular modeling language, that is UML. Okay? And from this UML we decided that we choose, and of course it is natural, that we will use use case diagrams. And when we use use case diagrams, that we need to identify all these things like actors, scenarios, use case, and so on. We already considered how to identify, not how to identify, what are guidelines for identification of actors, what are guidelines for identification of scenario, and then we also consider what are guidelines for identification of use cases. In particular, in use case we need to identify flow of events, and this is presented in natural language, and we provide also some guidance how to do it. I will repeat this part a little bit because it is quite important. So first of all, you remember that use cases always initialized by actor. After that, other actor can use and interact, but it's always initialized by actor. Each use case has name, and it represents the complete flow of events, and each use case has a termination condition. Then we consider, sorry, it was too fast, simple use case writing scenario that include very good hint what to do, in particular to name use case with verb phrase, actor name with noun phrase, then use active voice but not passive voice, and other things. We consider our first example of formulating use case for a system that manage accidents or incidents that involve officers, police officers, and central board or dispatcher. And we recognize some flaw in this description. For example, that name should be verb, name of use case. Then we don't have to use passive voice because it is not clear what to do. And sorry, who do what, but just that something happened. Also, we do not have to leave incomplete transactions, and so on. After you develop your use case first version, you always try to refine it. It's difficult to develop the complete version from the first time. Typically, you have to refine. And if in your first first version you mainly focus on boundaries of the system, in refinement you consider more detail about system constraints associated with system and the features provided by system. So you name element manipulated system in detail. You consider even low level sequences, but not only high level sequences of interactions or flow of events. You define access rights, and some of functionalities can be factored out via approaches that we have already in use case diagram, like extend, include, and also inheritance. So if we go to refined use case, then we already have correct name, we already have participating actors, and define all exceptions, and then flow of event may look like this. It's just example, we don't follow it, but you see quite good level of details. So try to be detailed as much as possible, because the more you write, the better will be situation for or condition for implementation. So typically you do or develop your use case in several refinements. Start with one and go to the next. So don't stop with first. Try to improve it. Okay? Okay. Yes?
In the flow of events.
Sorry?
In the flow of events, do you ever have an exit case like in the middle of the flow? Like, do you ever mention an exit case?
Exit case?
Yeah, like.
No, exit case is separately described, exit conditions. They are not here, but okay, they were here. They are described not in the middle of floor, but as a separate exit conditions.
Yeah, but maybe sometimes you would like to go from A to B, but somewhere in the middle.
You would like to exit in the middle, yes?
Or at least there's an option to exit.
Yeah, it's also possible. But then you summarize what happened. So even if it's something in the middle, it's some conditions that happen. You mention it also in exit conditions separately. Even this condition was thrown or appear in your flow of event. Okay? So this is like annotating your use case. Exit condition, entry condition, and flow of event, something happened, but if some condition happened, for example, receiving acknowledgement, that will be in flow of event, then it is exit. Okay? Was this your question, yeah? Okay, good. Okay. So, just to tell you that more detail can be added. But then, of course, writing all this flow of event and exit and entry condition depend on your application, but something can be considered as a general for all application. Try to structure your use case and use any possibility to factor out it, to modularize, to make it more compact. Of course, if it is very small use case, nothing. But in many cases, use cases are quite big, and it is difficult to read. So what possibility we have to factor out and structure our use cases? You remember? I already mentioned them, but just to repeat. Extend, include, generalization via inheritance. This is what we use to improve structure of our use case. Try to use them as much as possible. Okay? So, because this allows reduce complexity of model, and also you have more detail, and you separately describe some use cases that easy to understand and implement. So, first I didn't mention, but one more thing can be done. You can also put communication relation on your diagram. It means that you not only have officer and dispatcher and use cases, but who doing what. How you can do it? For example, via stereotypes. Okay? It means that field officer initiates this case, and this dispatcher participates. This will be also easy. And then dispatcher initiate open incident, and it also initiate allocate resources. So this is first simple information, but usage of stereotypes here. Why it is stereotype? Because actually there are some stereotypes in system, but you can also define your stereotype and agree upon usage. Okay? Okay. Then you can use extend or include. I do not repeat very carefully or very detailed about what is extend and include. We already considered this. But in brief, extend is used for exceptional situation, and include is just for modularization of some functionality. Like in your program, you decide this part of program can be separate module. Okay? And usage of include, there are existing functions and how we can reuse them. For example, in this case, we have different use cases, open incident, allocate resources, but they both can use view map. Okay? Otherwise, you can put this flow of event inside of each of these cases. But I believe it is very clear. Extend, something happens that is not related to normal flow of operation. For example, somebody would like to call help for system. Okay? Okay. But you also can use inheritance. Different with usage inheritance and previous solution, for example, extend, is that inheritance considers that you describe the same use case, but with a different level of abstraction. In case of extend, you define different use cases. Okay? So you can use whatever you want, but you should understand if it is really one use case but just increasing the specialization, then it is inheritance. If there is just separate use cases but just one invoke another, then other can be done, include, for example. Okay. I especially go fast through this part because I think that we already considered this, just reminding. But when you draw your use case diagram, when you define all this flow of events and other things, it's not end of story. It's not finished with your requirement elicitation. It is what you have to do also. You have to help developer to find objects from what you wrote. You remember that in object-oriented programming it is difficult, the difficult part is to decide which objects to use, which classes. And reading this text may be a bit problematic. We will see method for identification of classes just after finishing this lecture. Next part will be. But in requirement elicitation, there are some possibility to help finding this object also can be done, and it's called initial analysis object. Because how do you find them? Actually, when you talk to your client, you use different terminology. Terms that you do not understand, you can put separately, and then can kind of glossary where explanation of these terms happens. This is just for explanation, but at the same time they are good candidate to be classes. So try to create this glossary of terms that you use for communication with client. This glossary will include different terms that can be a candidate for participating objects. For example, in our case, when we talk about report emergency, then dispatcher, emergency report, field officer, incident, they all are very good candidates to be classes. It's not 100%, but they are very good candidates. Okay? So try to help next person who will implement to give hints what are possible classes. And one of way to do this could be to create a set of terms that are used for communication with with the client. More particular heuristics for identifying initial analysis objects are here. The terms that developer or user must clarify to understand the use case, recurring nouns in the use case, real-world entity that system must track, real-world processes that system must track, use cases that are already defined. All use cases can be a candidate to be classes. Okay? Data source, thing, artifacts with which the user interact, and all terms from application domain. After you have such a list, it can be used not only to transfer knowledge to next stage, but also to validate your design, to your requirement elicitation. You can look this participating object from perspective how good they are presented in use cases. For example, which use case creates some object that you consider as participation object. If there are no such objects, then you have to such use case, then you have to describe it. Which actor can access this information, or which use case modify destroy object? Which actor can initiate these use cases? Is this object needed? For example, you define some terms, but it's never used in your flow of events. Then maybe it is not needed. So what I told you now, that in addition to use case, in addition to flow of event, exit, entry condition, so on, you define also a set of participating object, potential classes that can be recognized using some guidelines that I presented on previous slide. And then when you define such objects, try to see if they are used in your use case. Okay? Maybe you define, okay, this term is new, I don't know, it is in my glossary, but then there was no usage of this case, or this term. Then it is not necessary object for further implementation. Okay? Is it clear? Any questions? Okay. I spend more time on that because this is part of our homework. When you will be next homework, will be there are not a big guess you don't to understand what about will be our homework. It will be first about requirement elicitation, second about requirement analysis, third about system design, and so on. So this was some hint to you for homework for requirement elicitation. Okay? Okay. And summary, I actually already said everything that was needed, that we define find functional and non-functional requirements. You remember how to find non-functional requirements? What is the possible approach? You don't remember? It was only yesterday. This is what. Yeah, you remember. Yes, use this model that suggest what are possible non-functional requirements, and try to see, do you need all of them, some of them, and what is missed in your specification. Okay? Okay, good, very good. Okay, and then you can when you decide about modeling language, then based on this modeling language, but for us it is only one language, UML, you will find the particular representation, use case diagram, and try to find component of this representation. Okay, this is what was all what I wanted to tell you about requirement specification or requirement elicitation.